It just never seems to end. We are still adjusting to the news of the worst unemployment rate in 11 years. Now, the Finance Minister tells us we are in a fiscal crisis. Let's get some more reaction to Tito Mboweni's medium-term budget. We're now joined by Christopher Yoon, a PwC economist, and Neil Coleman from the Institute for Economic Justice, both from Cape Town. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time. If I may start with you, Christy, your reaction to what the Finance Minister had to say today?
Well, I think he tried his best to give us good news. He tried his best to show us what they are doing, what they've done so far. But overall, quite shocking, some of those numbers. Growing budget deficit, significant increase in planned government debt, revision downwards for economic growth projections. Overall, really not a nice document to read, really not a nice speech to listen to. I must say I have sympathy for the Finance Minister in the fiscal situation that's going on at this stage.
Neil Coleman, are you also sympathizing with the Finance Minister?
Unfortunately, I can't feel very sympathetic, because I think that Treasury in particular and the Minister have not been prepared to engage openly and listen to alternatives. I think what we're seeing now is an inevitable result of implementing the wrong policies. And if we look internationally, in Europe, from Greece to Portugal and a number of other countries around the world, what we find, and this has been admitted by the International Monetary Fund, is that austerity doesn't work, because for a simple reason that when you implement austerity, when you cut back on spending and you cut and you cut and you cut, what you do is you kill growth and stimulus in the economy. You get less taxes, less growth. The debt to GDP ratio rises because the debt to GDP is a ratio of the size of the gross domestic product, which is the size of the economy. And if you're killing the economy through austerity, then you're going to start missing all your targets. And that's what we saw today. Deficits rising, the debt rising, and more cutting, and it's completely the wrong way to go. We need to completely revisit the debate around macroeconomic policy.
Well, the Minister, Neil Coleman, says our problem is that we spend more than we earn, and it's as simple as all that.
You know, the Treasury and conservative economists like to talk about an economy like a household. And they say, well, if you spend more than you earn, then you're running into all sorts of problems. But the reality is that economies don't work that way. They're dynamic organisms. Economies use debt in prudent ways to invest in areas which generate economic growth, productive investment, development. And if you do that, what you do is you develop the size of the economy, you grow the tax base, and so on and so forth. So if you're shrinking all of these denominators, then what you're doing is you're shrinking the size of the economy, and you're therefore growing your debt. And that is why our deficit and our debt levels are growing and will continue to grow. And I don't think it was very wise to paint these sort of scaremongering scenarios about debt being out of control, because what we've got to look at is, are there other ways to bring the debt under control outside of austerity? And there are some very good examples internationally which show us that there are, through investing, through fiscal stimulus, through monetary policy stimulus. And the whole notion of a counter-cyclical economic policy is that when your economy is stagnant and in depression, what you do is you stimulate it in order to get it kick-started again. And what we're doing is the opposite. It's what's called pro-cyclical. We're cutting back when our economy is stagnant. And that is a recipe for deepening unemployment and poverty and underdevelopment.
Well, we'll get to what you think needs to be done and where the examples of what you're going to give are. But if I may come back to you, Christy, what do you think, or from where you sit, what is responsible for our national debt now topping 3 trillion, and from what the Finance Minister said today, this may grow to 4.5 trillion by 2022-2023?
Well, the biggest challenge is exactly what the Finance Minister said. We are spending more than we're earning, and then budget deficits need to be financed through debt. So our problem is we're not earning enough money for the government to spend, and that is a product of the weak economy. Tax revenues are directly linked to the health of the economy. So if you've got a fast-growing economy, you've got fast-growing tax. So the situation in South Africa over the past 5 years has been that we've had economic growth which has been below population growth. So we've seen a decline in GDP per capita. So that basically means that households are becoming a bit poorer every year, to be frank about that. To get the fiscal situation improved, to get the debt situation improved, we need to see the economy growing at a much faster rate. Now, we often see that people expect the Finance Minister with these budget speeches to announce miracles on how we're going to turn the economy around. But he's more of an accountant and more of an economist than he is, in that sense, a policymaker. Many policies lie outside of his control, and some of these policies that we're looking at the moment, which are weighing on business confidence, is not something that he can really do something about. So we actually need the rest of government, and the President in particular, to make sure that the policy direction of the country is so that business confidence improves, which in turn leads to more investment, more job creation. That then translates into a greater tax revenue, which in the end will help us getting the fiscal ship where it should go and the debt situation under control.
Well, Christy, in addition to weak economic growth, the Finance Minister also spoke about low profitability of companies and weak household consumption.
Yes, that's correct. So household consumption is under pressure because of this increasing unemployment rate, and the Finance Minister is concerned about that because lots of the VAT that the government gets in comes from household spending. He's concerned with the health of companies within a tough business environment because that's where corporate taxes come from. If the company isn't making profits, it's not really paying much corporate tax, it's not paying bonuses to its employees, which would have been extra income tax that the government could get. So he's validly concerned with these points. It all gets, for me, back to the issue of this kind of business confidence, which we know, as measured, is at the moment at a 20-year low. If we can improve sentiment amongst big business, we can see more investment, more job creation. People will spend more, so there's more in tax revenue for the government from a VAT side. Companies will earn bigger profits if we've got a better business environment, so there's more corporate revenues. So he actually hit the nail on the head. We've got a tax problem that's spread across the different tax categories, but it all boils down to the point that if we get an economy that's healthier, that's growing quicker, where businesses are more willing to spend, we can see greater revenue for the government.
Well, Neil Coleman, if, as Christy just said, the Minister was really speaking to objective reality, but you, on the other hand, seem to suggest that a lot of these things are in fact self-inflicted. What do you think needs to be done to get to that, to make that systemic change that you're suggesting needs to be made?
Well, I think the first point, Vuyo, is about what shouldn't be done, and what shouldn't be done is the path we're pursuing, because by cutting back systematically, the minister talked about cutting 150 billion rand in spending back in the next few years. Initially, Treasury spoke about 326 billion that they want to cut in the next 3 years, and they simply cannot do this. They cannot manage to do this because already they've squeezed spending to the bone. So clearly there has to be a new way to put stimulus in the economy. What a lot of countries have done is to borrow for investment in productive activity, in infrastructure, and those sorts of things. But what we found in the last few years is that public sector investment, also from the government as well as from the state-owned enterprises, has collapsed. So that investment is not taking place. Now, if you're cutting back so drastically, there is going to be no money for investment. So you're simply making the situation worse. The opposite of that is to find ways to inject a fiscal stimulus into the economy. And that can be through a range of ways which people have been talking about, through borrowing, through judicious borrowing. There's no problem with us finding investors in our bonds at the moment because, interest rates in the developed world are very low. So our bonds are relatively attractive for international investors. And we have these massive funds in the retirement funds which can be redirected into productive investment. A combination of that together with a more expansionary monetary policy through making credit more affordable to encourage businesses to invest and through government investing much more actively. That begins to get the wheels of the economy turning. So that's really what we need. We need a stimulus. And, government, instead of sticking to this rigid orthodoxy, which has been shown not to work, should get around the table with a range of economists and people with different views in order to engage on these alternatives in all earnestness before the February 2020 budget, so that we can actually begin to look at alternative ways to address these issues, because the current mechanisms that government is using are simply not working. And basically the minister admitted that repeatedly, that they were unable to reach the targets that they have set for themselves.
Christy, we know that when we went into a recession, the government came up with some stimulus package that seemed to really not achieve what it was intended to achieve. Your thoughts on what Neil Coleman has said about a stimulus package he says, or he reckons, is needed?
Yes, you're quite correct. The Finance Minister admitted that over the past decade we've been trying to spend this economy into growing, but it hasn't been that effective. And one point that Neil made is that we need to borrow money and spend it on productive investment. And I think the repeated comments from the Finance Minister about just how many people work for the state, how much money it takes to have that large public sector payroll, I think too much of the money that we've borrowed has gone in towards staff costs and not towards productive expenditure. So I would definitely agree that spending cannot be cut back indefinitely or too much, because government spending is part of the economy. We cannot ignore that. And the best way would be to channel this towards productive investment. This hasn't been the case both by central government and state-owned enterprises. So I think if we want to keep up with the spending that we have at the moment, we would definitely need to readjust the priorities. I know that infrastructure spending has suffered in the past few years as we have needed to keep up with staff costs. It should actually be the other way around. We need to be able to keep spending as a government, but spending on productive activities, which is something that supports the economy both short-term and long-term in terms of growth.
If you've just joined us, we're in conversation with Neil Coleman and Christy Viljoen. That conversation continues when we return in a moment.